condition her behavior on action outcomes that happen somewhere else at a different time, right? So she's literally got to spread information about reward over this space. Would it help? Sorry. Okay. So, and this is a sort of core problem, maybe the core problem in reinforcement learning, of course, which is that what you have to do in these sort of sequential decision problems, of which, again, spatial mazes are a classic example, is figure out the consequence of your actions in terms of rewards you might get many steps later on, kind of non-locally over space and time. So it's hard to figure those connections out, hard to learn the value and consequences of your actions at a distance. And even if you know kind of the map or the model of the world, as we often talk about, it's even hard just to compute that, to figure out what to do. Even if I tell you the rules of chess, it's hard to play. And you can see that in a different way, even in the thing we usually think of as the objective function for reinforcement learning, the quantity we think the animal's trying to maximize, which is sort of the sum of future rewards, right? And you can just look at it and see, well, I want to choose the action in my location that's got the greatest value. When it's value, it's the reward of the next step after that, the next step after that. And it necessarily involves this connections over time, right? Which are hard to make. And so the question is, how does the brain do this? And again, I like the spatial example because it physicalizes it. It really lets you see what the problem is. Okay, so what I thought about today is this experiment where I think we have managed to actually visualize and measure value propagating around the world in a way that has been hard for us to do so far, and it will hopefully dovetail with our understanding of what we think the neural mechanisms for this kind of assignment are. And the second part is in a sort of theory, which is somewhat earlier and also later, about how we think this assignment works. We haven't quite closed the circle in terms of the experiment sets up, I think, the ability to test the theory, but we're not quite there yet, but it's sort of progress report. Okay, so historically, of course, the most famous single way of thinking about this problem that goes back to the 90s to Judah, Wolfram Schultz, Montague, is this temporal difference learning model, right? And so it was observed that dopamine neurons in initially the primate midbrain, but this is that same rat that you just saw. She's got a fiber photometry set up, and we're measuring dopamine using the fluorescent sensor D-light. So this is when she gets to the reward port, and if she gets a reward or not, you see this beautiful prediction error signal. That is, you see a positive prediction error if she's unexpected to be rewarded, more so if she's expecting a reward more, and less so if she's expecting a reward less, or vice versa, sorry, and vice versa for negative prediction error. So there's a classic prediction error signal, and there's been a long idea that these dopamine neurons carry this temporal difference error signal. And that in turn, although this has not been especially paid a lot of attention to, a part of the story was the fact that theoretically, the way these temporal difference algorithms spread value around an extended state space, like over a trajectory, is through this backward chaining. So the first time I run through the reward here, it tells me about expectations here. The next time I run through it, passes back to here and to here and to here and so on for multiple passes. And so there's this thing called bootstrapping or chaining that is a sort of core prediction of these theories, tightly linked to this particular prediction error signal and its properties that people had argued dopamine neurons carry. And so I think those of you who are old enough to remember, I think like around the turn of the millennium, people just thought this was how the brain solves these problems. Like we solved it, like neuroscience had figured it out. And it just isn't. Like, so first of all, there's really mixed and not great evidence that value spreads along paths this way at all. Even if it does, it's not clear that that's good enough to solve tasks the way animals do. And so the slogan for this, which you might have heard, is that these algorithms are so-called model-free, and animals appear to use more model-based sort of inferential reasoning. They understand things about the layouts of mazes and sort of infer things about paths, as we'll discuss. And so things are more complicated, of course, than the classic story. We're going to come back to this. There's new stuff going on in the run-up to the reward as well. Okay, so how does the mouse, the rat, behave in this maze? So not surprisingly, so we're changing the reward probabilities at these ports and the distances are configuring the maze. And what you can see is that in all of the animals, their chance of choosing a port in a sort of block level or file-wise within a block depends on how good that port is relative to the alternative, because it's always choosing between the two that they leave one and choose from the other two. And they like to go to the closest one. So they sort of balance probability and distance, or reward and distance, as you would expect. But of course, they have to learn this by trial and error. And that's the sort of credit assignment problem there. How does value get around the maze? One sort of crude way to look at that is just to ask, let's say on some trial I go from here to here, and then I get reward or not, right? If on the next trial I come back here and I can go to here or here, how likely am I to go here again versus switch, right? And the answer is, and this is the sort of learning rule at the trial level for reward, on the next trial, if they come back, they're more likely to go back again if they were rewarded than not, right? So that that's like a little piece of the learning rule, right? Where experience drives your choices towards reward. So this is the sort of most zoomed out view, and this is the most zoomed in view. Interestingly, so first of all, this happens as I've emphasized, at kind of a long distance, right? Like it's not like the animal is choosing to go here. He's got to be back here somewhere where the path splits. Depends exactly on how the map is laid out, but it's action at a distance. It's also the case if the animal goes from here to here and gets a reward and then goes to here, you could ask, does this reward have any effect on their behavior? And in the sort of classic temporal difference learning algorithms, the answer would be no, because they only learn experientially. So they could learn along this path that this sort of a left turn was the right thing to do, but in general, back here somewhere, experience along this path doesn't tell you how to make turns along a different path, right? Now there's a piece of the path that's shared, so there's a little bit hard of an argument to make in terms of behavior. We'll come back to it in terms of neural data in a second. But in general, this is the kind of generalization that's associated with more sort of model-based inference. It's not just experiential learning, and the animals do that too, so just as well. Okay, so that's the kind of first evidence that something here is going on kind of beyond the sort of simple story, both in terms of the range and also in terms of the sort of non-locality of the credit assignment. But really, it's hard to make this argument directly from behavior. So let's look in the brain. So Josh, the senior author on this work, has been extremely interested in this phenomenon of so-called dopamine ramps. So you can see this at a sort of smaller scale in the prediction error I showed you before. The neural signal, the dopamine sort of background signal as the animal runs toward the port is sort of ramping up. And maybe it doesn't quite ramp all the way to the end, and that's a whole other story. But basically what you see is as the animal's running up to the port, dopamine's increasing, and how much it increases is further modulated by aspects of value. So if the reward probability is high at that port in ground truth versus low, the ramp is steeper, and other things, as we'll see. So it appears that we have a sort of readout in this ramp along the maze by looking at this aspect of dopamine. What are the animals or the brain and the dopamine system's beliefs about value at all these locations? If you buy Josh's interpretation that that's what this signal is reporting. And it does look like it matches value in the sense that value is discounted by delay or distance, and so it has this kind of ramping property. You can even look at individual trials, and this is two trials from a model in which we estimate value over the maze, in particular, the particular route where the animal actually ran in this trial, and you see that it sort of matches up well, even at a single trial level, and I'm showing you this in broad brush here to quantify this and test it and so on. Now, there's a whole fight about whether this is really value or it's a side effect of prediction error and so on. I'm happy to discuss that if people want, but let's just take it at face value. I don't think it really matters because I think everybody agrees that this signal carries for whatever reason, the signal reflects value. So we're going to leverage that to understand how value moves around the maze as the animal samples rewards. Okay. Okay, so let's go at it. So here is the first observation, and it sort of cracks the behavior. Let's say we do this thing where the animal goes back and forth and then back again. And let's consider two types of trials. Ones in which they go out and get rewarded and go back and then back again. Or conversely, where they go out and don't get rewarded and go back again and go back. And what you see is all the way along the path from one port to the other, so a meter or something, this dopamine ramp is larger following a reward than it was following a non-reward, right? So this is a non-reward, run down the path, it's low, get rewarded, run down the path again, it's now higher. And if you do it the other way, you're rewarded, and then you run down the path and you're non-rewarded, then it's lower. So the whole value function, if that's what this is, shifts along the entire extent of it. Okay, so this so reward is not just affecting the adjacent hexes when the animal gets it, it's sort of propagating over the entire path. And which makes sense that the behavior reflects that as well, right? Moreover, again, similar to the behavior, this is true not just if you run back and forth and back on the same path, but if you run along the alternative path. The alternative path moves up and down to the same extent. It seems to know as much about the reward at the end as the experienced path does. And again, this is the sort of things associated with stuff like model-based algorithms. That credit for this reward is being assigned all over the maze. Okay. Not just locally and not just along the experienced path. And you can just read this off. So I should say, the advantage of this is that you can visualize it directly in the data, and I think it's very compelling. We do lots of statistical tests to control for things and make sure this isn't an artifact of correlations and rewards or something. One thing we can do is only measure this response along the part of the trajectory that doesn't overlap, to make sure it's not something about the overlapping part between the experienced and non-experienced, and indeed it's not. So again, I'm just going to give you this as a big picture, but I think these results are, as far as I can tell, believable.
Nathaniel,
yes.
Why is dopamine altering the prior one as well?
Why is it altering in the prior run?
Yeah.
I think it's because of the way it's selected. So it's selected so as to be a non-reward followed by a reward, or a reward followed by a non-reward. So, and I don't think that confounds the interpretation, but it helps you see what's going on. Okay, now, so this part, I think, matches what we would have expected from behavioral, although not what we would have expected from temporal difference learning, at least, sort of naive temporal difference learning. But it is also the case, actually, that if you look carefully, and this is a little harder to see in the averages, but I think I'm quite convinced that it's also real. You can actually see superimposed on the whole function moving up and down, you can see this process of chaining where the individual reward you get at the end of the path chains backwards over a series of runs along the path, as is predicted by the sort of really classic PD0 algorithm. And again, it's vastly not possible that this is driving a large scale behavior because it's too slow, but it's there in the neural signal, just as was sort of predicted by the sort of classic models. So let's see if I can unpack this. What this is going to be is you're going to have a series of trials that average over lots of trials and lots of rats, but because we have tons of data. These are situations for visualization in which the rat runs down the same path 5 times in a row or 4 times in a row, non-reward, reward, non-reward, non-reward. So the idea is we want to see a single reward superimposed against a background of non-reward so we can watch the bump course of value corresponding to that sort of chain backward along the path. And every time it's showing the way it looked last time and the way it looked this time. The first one you see it move up for reward, and you start to see a bump related to that reward perhaps. The next time you see it move down for non-reward, here's the bump. The next time you see it maybe move down a little more, but the bump has now moved backwards and so on. So there are other ways of quantifying this effect. One of them, which I'm scared I won't be able to explain, is that you can, if you try to regress the history of rewards from different trials in the past, 1 trial ago, 2 trials ago, 3 trials ago, 4 trials ago, onto the dopamine response at different distances from the port, 1 hex ago, 2 hexes ago, 3 hexes away from the port, and so on, then this type of bump predicts that the largest effect of a reward is going to be older rewards as you get farther away. As you get closer in, the response will be dominated by more recent rewards. As you go farther, it has to be dominated by more distant history rewards, and that's exactly what you see in this type of progression. It just sort of drops out. So it really does seem like this chaining mechanism for sparing value around really is present, at least in the neural data. We don't really have a behavioral correlate of it. And the other thing to say, people who are real aficionados might know there's something called TD lambda that interpolates between sort of long-term credit assignment and short-term training. And we don't think this is that, in the sense that TD lambda never showed that both of these things superimposed upon each other, sort of as bigger bumps or smaller bumps. But it looks like, in a sense, there's 2 value. It's strong to say without further evidence, but it's looking like there's 2 value propagation mechanisms here. One is this chaining, and one is this global assignment. Okay, so that's what we've seen, and we, have also fit models to this and so on. But I think what's nice about this is using this dopamine ramp, we can really directly visualize the sort of spatial credit assignment, and we can really see this TD0 effect that's been so hard to see if it was really real, and the literature is very mixed on it. But over and above that, and I think much more important behaviorally, value is spreading in a way that looks much more model-based. That is, the value and choice is affected far away on the very next trial, and not just over experienced paths, but over other possible paths into the same port. And so that leads to the question, which is where this work is going, but it's not done yet, which is really, how is this happening, right? Like, now that we have a sort of clear signature of value being transported over space, what's going on? So I think the most standard answer to that question is sort of non-local replay in hippocampus, as I'll talk about, and it's usually assumed, although not for a particular good reason, I think, that is occurring maybe forward to choice. So we don't really know when, between the time the animal gets to the reward and the time he next gets to the location where his brain is reflecting that reward, does the information move, from one place to another. It could be that he's thinking ahead. It could also be that he thinks backwards when he gets the reward and updates things all along different parts of the maze. And that seems in our models of the data to fit better. It's really going to take looking at hippocampus and so on to find out. Okay, so that's the sort of first half of what I have to say. The second half is about more theoretical work about the sort of value transport mechanism, and setting up the kind of predictions that we hope to, finally closing the circle, and again haven't done, test in this type of experiment once we have hippocampal recordings going. Okay. So again, this is, I think, a widely hypothesized but sort of under-tested perspective, which is that, of course, place cells in the hippocampus famously, while the animal's running around, report where the animal is or thinks he is, or fire in a way that correlates with that. But also famously, when the animal's standing still, they have these events called sharp wave ripples, in which the hippocampal population representation very rapidly moves over space. So it runs maybe 10 times faster than the animal runs. It carves out a coherent trajectory often, and often that trajectory predicts where the animal is going to go. So this is one such event, of course, among many, from a classic Pfeiffer and Foster paper, the decoded hippocampal position, animal standing still here, time is about 120 milliseconds. This is where the reward is that he's about to run to. So he thinks about it and then he runs to it. And this seems very suggestive, right? The idea would be, in this kind of situation, when the animal got rewarded here, if the animal came back here and wanted to think about whether it was worth turning left, turning right here, he could do this kind of forward simulation, retrieve this location, find the reward there or not there, and that would help him sort of do the spatial credit assignment, right? If this is what's going on, or any version of this, that would be amazing, because it would take this covert thing, which is what is the animal thinking about, which routes does he contemplate when, is it forward or backwards, is it at the end of the trial, the beginning of the trial, and render it into something that we could actually measure. And indeed, even without measuring it in this task, I think we could learn a lot just by considering the properties of this type of activity. And so let's do that. So if we take this idea seriously, and again, it's only a hypothesis, I think we can immediately conclude a few things, or hypothesize a few things. The first thing I notice about this is it's like one path at a time, right? It's not a sphere, it's not a cone, right? It's just a path, right? So the search is serial. And presumably that's because the hippocampus is like tractors, and so they only represent one location at a time. So you really, the searching through possible paths in the world has to be serialized, and that's going to, I'm going to argue, force you to prioritize. If you can't think about everything at once, which path are you going to think about next? Moreover, I mentioned that this only happens when the animal's standing still, right? When the animal's running, the hippocampus, again, can only represent one location, more or less. It's busy tracking his actual location. When he stops, that's when you get this. So it has a sort of opportunity cost. The animal can run, or he can think where to run, but he can't do both at the same time. Again, if this is substrate for the and then finally, Lauren Frank, who is also a collaborator on the work I just showed you, the first time I talked to him about this, so he's worked for many years on hippocampal place cell recordings, and I said, I'm really excited about this planning stuff, and he said, oh, that's hogwash. And the reason it's hogwash is that in my hands, in the tests that I use, I never see any of this forward replay stuff. I always see backward replay at the end. The animals never stop while they're running where they're going. They only stop at the end when they get rewarded, and then you see a bunch of backward replay. That's not planning. They can't be planning. That's backwards. That's nuts. That's nonsense, Nathaniel. I think, you know, he raises an interesting point, but I think that's part of what's interesting here is that if what you view the function of planning as is not just thinking about what places could I get to from where I am, but how do I spread information about reward around the world? In particular, if I discover, you know, if I'm the rat in a previous maze, I find a reward at the corner, you could think about how else could I have gotten here, right? And then you would do sort of backward replay along other routes into the same path, and that would allow you to do the same thing if you then update, you know, value correlates at those locations as thinking forward later on, right? So you can spread value around in lots of different ways. And if you think of credit planning in the forward sense as only one piece of credit assignment in the more general sense, I think that starts to make sense. All right. Okay, and that also leads to a question which I think is sort of bedeviled this literature. There's been lots of, you know, papers about replay in the hippocampus for a long time. And the tendency seems to say that, well, you know, you get reverse replay in some circumstances and forward replay in other circumstances. And so that probably means they do different things. And what I'd like to suggest is maybe they all do the same thing, that is spreading information about value around, sort of credit assignment or value transport. And the reason in different circumstances you see different patterns has more to do with what it is about tasks that favor certain, that put pressure on the animal to plan in different ways, to push value around in different ways. It has to do with its distance of a task and time and many different things. And we'll unpack a little bit of that now. And again, on that view, and I think on any view really, the world is a big world. And so if you only think about one route at a time or run, you have this real selection question, right? The problem facing the brain is, which path should I think about? When should I think about it? And when should I run? And again, the serial nature, the opportunity cost of this really enforces that problem upon you. So we're going to try to write down a solution to that problem. And I think that's illuminating with respect to why these neurons behave the way they do. Okay, so this worked by Salamata in the lab. So the model is very simple. So a toy model. The idea is we're going to take, again, this sort of very simple local TD chaining algorithm we think dopamine does, and we actually see correlates of dopamine doing now. And we're going to say this is kind of fundamental building block of valuation in the brain. But we're going to extend this sort of classic story where this happens over experience trajectory. So you run along a trajectory and dopamine does its thing. And so you back reward up, you chain it along that path. And we're going to say when the animal's standing still, it can also activate pairs of states locally and chain value one from the next in the same way. Maybe it literally hippocampus activates a non-local trajectory and that drives dopamine, potentially. So the slogan for this, which Rich Sutton, one of the fathers of reinforcement learning, I think said, is that planning is like learning from simulated experiences. The brain's going to simulate paths around the world, and it's going to push value along them. And that's one way to sort of implement sort of model-based reinforcement learning, if those paths reflect them well. And then the question just becomes the prioritization question is, which location should the animal perform backups at? Which one should he reactivate when? And we just sort of write down a sort of ideal observer model of this. Based on the observation that, and again, there's a toy model, it's just meant to show you what are the consequences of sort of optimal planning. It's not meant to like build a better mouse. The observation is that the reason planning has value is that if you do a lot of thinking, you can figure out where to go and you can earn more cheese sooner, right? So in certain circumstances, you can make better choices if you push value around the world quickly compared to pushing around the world slowly. Can we quantify that, right? And units of expected future cheese. And the answer is we sort of can. And the idea is that we'll quantify that. How much more can we earn by thinking in expectation? We call that the expected value of backup. It's literally an expected value in the same sense of, pressing a lever carries expected value, only it's an operation in your brain. And then we say overall the location I can think about in my brain, which one has the highest expected backup, that's the one I think about. And I'm not, this is published, I just want to give you a sort of slight sense of how the theory works. I'm happy to discuss more, but I don't need to belabor the details. But what it turns out, the sort of heart of this paper is that Marcelo proved this beautiful theorem about this quantity expected value backup, which shows that it decomposes into the product of two terms, which he calls, based on connections to some previous work, he calls need and gain. So the intuition is that expected value of backup is kind of like lots of expected values. It's sort of like probability times magnitude. If I pay you different amounts depending on where the roulette wheel lands, probability of it landing someplace times what you win is the expected value, right? So for expected value of backup, in this setting, thinking about a particular location and an action that is leading from that location in some direction, the probability part is how likely and how soon am I to visit that place again? Because if I'm not going to go there, then thinking about it's not going to help me earn cheese. If I do go there and thinking about it could. And gain is, if I do get there, how much can I earn, right? Does thinking probably change my choice in a way that's going to potentially help me earn more cheese? And it's a product of those two things that tells you the sort of overall expected value of the backup. These are the equations. Again, we could talk about it, but I don't want to belabor it today. The main thing is that there's this finding that I've mentioned several times that in different circumstances, the hippocampal trajectories run both forwards or backwards. And I should have mentioned it really is backwards because in certain circumstances, these representations are directional. They represent the animal's head direction. And so you can actually tell the difference between running forward away from where you are behind you and running backwards away from where you are behind you. And the activity really runs backwards. So that aside, the claim is that need, all else equal, wants to push activity ahead of the animal. It wants to push activity towards places the animal is going to be. Gain, all else equal, for a reason I'll show you in a second, wants to push activity backwards behind the animal. It wants to say, I found something in the world. Where else could I push this information that would be useful? Can I chain this information backwards? Just like TD. And then overall priority is the balance of these two things because it's a product. And so depending on the particular structure of need and gain in a particular circumstance, you get forward or backward replay in different places. Okay, that's the theory. Good, I'm getting close to done. That's about the right time. So just to give you a little bit of more intuition, here's the kind of thing need looks like. Need is going to be places that I'm likely to be soon. That depends, on where I am and also where I've tended to go in the past. So as I get better at a task, I need sort of focuses. And again, so if you were replaying according to that alone, you'd want to replay close to yourself. Gain has the opposite property. So let's say I'm new to this maze, I've never been anywhere, and all of a sudden I find she's here. Now by the temporal difference learning chaining property we just talked about, I have exactly one place that I know that has high value. It's this place because value changed from here to here on step 0. That means I have gain in exactly one place, which is right behind me, because if I replay from here to here, I can learn that this place also has value. And if I replay again, I can learn that the place behind me has value, and so on. So gain produces these backward chains, each one setting up the circumstance for the left. So it's to spread value along paths you could have taken. And it's, again, the balance between these two things that drives forward and reverse replay in the model. Now, I think it's fair to say that right experiments haven't been done to test this, but nevertheless, I think this sort of really toy model makes sense of a lot of data that sort of accumulated over the years about the properties of place-cell replay. So just to give you a little bit of a feel for this, the paper has a lot of the stuff. One finding is that a number of people have shown that you tend to get forward replay at the beginning of a trial, and then the animals get to the end of the trial and get rewarded, and you see a replay, reverse replay. The model does this too, basically for the reasons I just said. That is, at the end of the trial, you learn something and you have a desire to push it backwards. At the front of the trial, you imminently need to do something, you need to figure out where to go. The details of gain explain a number of results about why certain events which are surprising and tell you about rewards or punishments in the world drive a lot of replay, and some of them don't, even though they all seem surprising. And it turns out that some of them are sort of actionable in terms of your choices, and some of them aren't. So for instance, if an animal gets shocked, he does a lot of thinking about the place that he would have gone where he used to get shocked, and then he doesn't go there. And again, sometimes people say, well, that's not planning, he's not going there. But in fact, that's exactly what this kind of algorithm is supposed to do. It's supposed to figure out if I go there, I'll get shocked, and therefore not go there. So it's exactly how planning should behave. And it changes with experience in sort of complicated ways that reflect changes in both need and gain, depending on the particular method that we have. Okay. Good. So that's at least a theory. And just recently, a paper came out arguing against this theory, and I thought the last thing I do is mention a little bit of work we've done actually with Thomas Ackham here at trying to come to terms with that. There's an alternative tradition basically in the hippocampal place cell world So I've suggested that replay is for, in a sense, pushing value around the map. The whole idea I started this talk with, right? And there's another view that says, no, it's really for learning the map itself, right? And that's sort of cheap talk because it's not really clear what that means, right? Like, it sure looks as though the replay follows coherent trajectories that reflect the map. It looks as though the brain knows the map or it can draw replays. So it's not clear what it really means on their view that replay learns the map for you. But part of what we're going to do is try to formalize that idea in a way that makes sense. But anyway, the evidence that they have put forward, is by Anna Gillespie, and again, my collaborator, Lauren Frank, who just gives me no space at all. So what Lauren and Anna showed is that the replay paths in hippocampus, this is, they did a particular test and the animal has to switch goals a lot. It's got like 6 different tunnels, and the animal has to run down different ones at different times to get reward. And what they see is that hippocampus, instead of, as we might have expected under the Matar model, which is to say that basically the hippocampal replay is telling us where to go, helping figure that out. It seems to lag and represent places the animal used to like to go, but aren't relevant anymore. So the replay paths to accompanying hippocampus lag the animal's current goals and also lag what the animal's behavior seems to know about those goals. This isn't, I think, a slam dunk, but it's sort of evidence that there's some detachment between the thing driving the replay and the thing controlling the animal. And it's also the case that, again, in contradiction to the model, as the animal in a new block starts going to the new target, you get more and more replay going to that target. But the animal's already figured out how to do it. So the animal's visited this place 15 times in a row, and only now is the activity starting to ramp up toward it. And again, that's not what you predict in the model, where as you figure out how to go there, you don't need to replay it anymore. So what Thomas and my student Tom Sagiv and I work on is an idea that sort of generalizes the model of pushing value around the world to a model in which you're not just learning how to get to your current goal, you're learning as a representation. If you know the successor representation, it's very similar to that. If not, don't worry about it. Thomas calls it the geodesic representation, or GR, but these are also the variants of the same thing. This is a representation of how to get from any place to any other place in the maze, how to get to any particular goal given where you are. So the Q function we usually say is how do you get to the goal that's the current goal, but if the goal were something else, there would be a different Q function. Stack all of those up and you have the GR. And you can learn all these from replay, and this I think explains what it means to learn routes when you already know the map. It's the same thing about spreading value, but it's spreading sort of counterfactual value. And so in short, what this means is that if you try to learn this thing, you have a current goal, but you're also trying to learn paths to other places in the world that you might have to navigate to in the future, like in future blocks of honest tasks. And in terms of computing priority, like which paths should I learn about, that should be kind of an expectation, not just over my current goal, but in terms of expected future discounted reward, which would include my future goals as well. And so I have to learn that distribution of future goals, and that is going to depend on goals I've seen recently, right? So in order to figure out how goals are distributed in the world, I've got to look backwards over multiple blocks, and the rewards in recent blocks are going to dominate my expectations about future goals as well. And so this model, which is again sort of a strict generalization of the Matar model, is pushing not just real value, but also in a sense, potential value around the maze. This one matches the Gillespie data very well. And Thomas has an experiment that's, I think, part of the motivation for building this theory is that I think Thomas is doing this experiment. I think is really going to nail this distinction, and so we should have a clear answer soon, if God be willing. Okay. Okay, so I think I'm done. What I told you in the beginning was, one long line of studies that we've worked on for a long time that shows that both behavior and things that we record in the brain really show us that the brain is pushing credit assignment, pushing reward around the world in a non-local way that reflects a sort of model or map of the world, carries information about rewards along paths you don't want to be able to take. And secondly, I've argued on the basis of other experiments, admittedly, because we haven't done the whole thing, that hippocampal replay, as it's been recorded in other mostly non-kind of reinforcement learning tasks, could be a real window into this process. And thinking through that carefully, I think exposes the role for selection. That is, if whatever replay does, if you understand what it does, that should tell you, that should explain why replay plays certain things in some situations and other things in other situations. That's going to be revealing about what replay does as well. And that's why we think value or generalization of value is a good model of this. And I think this explains existing place-cell phenomena, but those experiments, again, were really sort of dynamic reinforcement learning tasks of the sort that I started with. So to really close the circle and link this to value and choice, we need experiments like the one I mentioned that Thomas is doing, or hippocampal recordings of the one that I showed you. And the way that's going to work then, I think, is that the story I've just told you connects the animal's experiences, drives sort of need and gain, controls what gets replayed, updates value at different places in the maze. That drives things like dopamine ramps and also choices. So this is sort of claim of causal chain that you could actually record in or intervene in, in different points. And I think this theory is very testable. So that's what we're going to do in the X maze. We've done something like this in humans as well in a recent paper. I showed Tim Barron's here. I'm not going to go into it, but the conclusion seems to be this is sort of logically similar to the X maze. Replay is assessed through human MEG, is modulated or correlates with need and gain. So experience drives replay, and it seems to mediate value update is assessed by choices. So this is a rough cut at how this is going to work in animals. And that's where we are. So I'm happy to take questions. These are my collaborators, and thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. Any questions? Yes?
Thank you for this fascinating talk. So typically in reinforcement learning, people think that dopamine mediates the kind of propagation of the value. But in this replay event, they are very compressed in time. So do you think that dopaminergic signal would have enough resolution to propagate the value there? And if so, what other mechanisms would be involved?
I think it is known. I think the simplest idea is that you sort of light up the whole path over the course of 100 milliseconds, and dopamine pulses, and the whole path gets the value, right? That's the sort of zero order model. And I think it's known that dopamine, again, the right experiments haven't been done, but it appears that, sort of the players in striatum and dopamine itself are recruited during these events. Exactly that they're reporting the right things at the right times and stuff hasn't been carefully checked, but that's one of the things that we're hoping to do with Josh and Lauren, manipulate dopamine and see if it affects, say, these different aspects of credit assignment and so on. But that's the idea, but it's only an idea. Well, clearly it might be other things, but and it might not be replay at all. I mean, we'll have to see.
Lawrence?
Just thinking about the explanation of the data from the first part of your talk, and really nice data. I guess I wondered whether another possible mechanism for doing this kind of temporal value transport would not be doing it via rollout at replay time, I guess, but by embedding it in structured kind of options like representations of the map as a whole.
Yeah.
And so I kind of I wondered whether there was any evidence for that at all in those times that you were saying that the maze got reconfigured, because it seemed like that might be a time when the animal suddenly became very uncertain about the overall structure of the maze. And
yeah.
do you have any thoughts on
Yeah, no, I think it's a good, so a whole other not mutually exclusive, of course, but a whole other family. I mean, there are a number of different families of ways this could happen. And one is spectral representation, but it's similar ideas, or if you have, in a sense, neurons that are selective for paths, that they become sort of basis functions that can do credit assignment all at once when you get the reward or something. And so I think that's the kind of thing you have in mind. And then the question is, when the map reconfigures, how do you update those? So I think that, you know, this is something we've worked on separately, and I think it's a live hypothesis. I think it is, I'm doubtful that we're going to be able to tell the difference from behavior. You can tell that we haven't quite gotten to the point of modeling the behavior turn by turn as they relearn the route. So that's a challenging thing to do for a bunch of reasons. We're working on that. But I don't think it's going to uniquely tell us. I think it's going to be sort of ambiguous with respect to questions like that. So I think it's going to, again, I think looking in the brain is going to help us tell if there's no replay, or, you know, if we find place cells that are selected for weird routes or something. I think that will be the answer to the question. But
So there's nothing unique about what's going on at the dopamine around the time of the operations.
Well, there's one thing, actually. I don't think this answers your question, but one thing I skipped. The most striking thing in the dopamine is the first time they see a new path available to them, they enter a hex where there's an exit available that wasn't before. There's a spike of phasic dopamine, which is larger than any other spike of phasic dopamine in the study. So it looks like there's sort of a value, and then especially if the animals go there, there's sort of some kind of exploratory value or something. That doesn't answer your question at all, but that's what we have to, that's what we know. Everything else like I showed you is fit and estimated over both of those types of transitions, but we haven't zeroed in on specific like that thing.
I'm going to read a question from Charles, and then go back to here. So the question is, how can you distinguish between location and value in the second protocol? Can you have a rough estimate of value for the location and still know where to go, and then continue to move precisely learn the value of that location?
So we're talking about the second part, we're talking about the first. I think it's possible another contributor, and I know that in Thomas's experiment, I understand he's been working with this. It could be that one contributor to say this sort of loose value all along a path, might be spatial proximity, like ignoring all the walls and stuff. How close am I to the port? And I don't, I think it's possible that part of what's going on is closer to the port, you have more reward, farther to the port, you have less reward. And, you know, the dumbest version of the kind of mechanism that Lawrence was talking about could give you some sort of rough spatial propagation. I suspect that's a suggestion here. In terms of quantitatively fitting the neural data, that hasn't worked very well. I wouldn't claim to have 100% ruled it out, but we haven't gotten it to sort of explain the data. And I think the reason is, I mean, you see from the choices, I think this is also true of dopamine, you know, we move the walls around a lot. So the distance from here to here can be very short or very long, depending on the block. And choices are definitely, as you can see, exquisitely sensitive to this, but I think neural value is also. So neural value loses value along a path sort of counted in hexes and not just counted in as the crow flies distance. Now, and I doubt, although I guess it's theoretically possible we haven't got it to work, that that's all due to TD, right? I think it's the model based, the credit assignment seems to know about the configuration of the paths, but that's a sort of failure to get this to work more than a slam dunk argument.
Yes.
And so given that during sleep, replays, I understand more forward replay rather than reverse replay, and given your sort of hypothesis for the functions of the different types of replay, how would you interpret replay during sleep?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. So I think the concept would be that the same types of considerations apply to replay during sleep. I think what you don't have is that you're not in a particular situation, deciding what to do now. There's relatively few experiments. There's one experiment that claims that replay during sleep is like white noise, like Gaussian random walks. But that's during a situation in which what the animal was exposed to before going to sleep was a completely unstructured task where they're just dropping rewards in random places. And so from our perspective, our model is sort of like garbage in, garbage out, like there's no differentiation of the maze, like you just get random replay. One experiment that we looked at pretty carefully is one from someone named Olive Stotter, where an animal sees a reward in a T-maze through a window, falls asleep, and then preferentially dreams about what's going to be the path to reward, and then wakes up, they take away the window, and the animal runs to the reward on the sort of first try. So that's a sense in which replay could teach you something. You know, if I noticed that I'd like to come chat with you after the talk, and then I took a nap, I could dream about getting over there and then go talk chat with you. That our model predicts that kind of thing for the same reason. And that's the best, I think, example of it that we have. But I think, like everything else, you'd like more systematic experiments that sort of manipulate what replay could teach you and then let the animal sleep.
Okay, one more question.
Sure.
Is there any evidence on which dopamine pathway, direct or indirect, may involved for these value-based learning maps systems?
So I can't think of any. So let's see. A few things to say. I mean, in the first half of the talk, this is delight, right? So this is just dopamine, we're not separately imaging, D1, D2 or anything. In the last part of the talk, if the idea is, so I guess maybe the thrust of the question is, the very last point is that if replay is doing more than just pushing value around, perhaps you need more than a scalar value signal. So I think if this were to be true, I think that probably it isn't just dopamine that's driving the plasticity, right? You need sort of heavy learning along different sort of columns of this geodesic representation corresponding to different goals. A single dopamine channel isn't going to be good enough to tell each one of them how to get to its goal. So I think dopamine ceases to be the most plausible substrate if something like this is true. I should say maybe another thing about this. I view this, so Tim Barron's here, and again, Thomas, and a number of people have been thinking about replay even more generally as in being involved in sort of structured inference of all sorts, of which value inference and generalized value inference, so there's sort of particular examples. So I think of this being sort of the spirit of that work, moving away from a strictly value-based approach. But as it gets more abstract, I think it's probably less about reward and maybe less about dopamine too. But again, we'll have to see in the brain.
Okay. Yes.
Apologies if this is too basic this question. I guess your gain aspect, your model, seems to have a couple of components driving it. The sort of proximity to the goal, which you describe in the thing, and I guess that's common to some other algorithms. But you also have like an interesting effect where you're in a state where a change in policy could have a big change in outcome, right? Which is, it seems in a sense a wee bit more interesting than just arguing the goal. And so do you see that replay favors, trajectories that go through somewhere that if you think about it, and I have policy A versus B, it makes a difference. The outcomes. I think that's what
that's the idea. So I mean, there are a few things to say about that. And again, the data are pretty scarce, but the idea is that in certain circumstances, learning something is going to be actionable, and in certain circumstances it's not. And it's actually two circumstances. One is if it teaches you something you would have done is bad, and conversely, if it teaches you something else, or if it teaches something you wouldn't have done is better than you thought, and then it changes your mind in a positive way. So both of those two things carry gain, and it predicts this sort of pattern of interaction between, whether something is your favorite choice a priori and whether replay is going to tell you that it's good, better or worse than you thought. The best evidence we have for that is the experiments from Foster. I'm blanking on the first author. This is a News and Views he wrote, and I'm blanking on the actual paper. But they see these weird asymmetries in this shuttling thing between, better than expected rewards and worse than expected rewards in their setting. One drives your plane, one doesn't. And our interpretation is because the animal has to get the shuttle anyway, that's I think the worst expected reward isn't worth learning about because it's not going to change what you do. You still have to go and collect it to get to the other side and get the reward. And so this is our example, at least one of our examples of that property of gain. But again, something you'd like to test more directly. We have tested that in the human experiment with all the limitations of MEG and stuff. It seems that the replacement seems to comply with that, but it's not, again, the ideal test.
Okay, Johannes, do you see a question?
That question, the main thing was on the first part of the talk. Somehow you showed that an animal was walking on the left side, and then got reward, that affects also going on the right side of the base. And yeah, maybe I misunderstood that, but so isn't it sort of misaligning of credits? So was it how spatially specific is this?
Oh, so in fact, objectively, there's a reward probably associated with the port. And if you sometimes you're choosing between this port and this port because you're starting here. Sometimes you're choosing between this port and this port because you're starting here, but the reward probably associated with the port. So whether you came this way or this way, rewards here are relevant to that choice.
Yes, and it's spread up on the top, basically, right? But you showed that the trajectory from the bottom right to the top was already increased, or like doing was already increased at very early stage. Right?
I don't think that, I mean, is this the question about how it's selected? I think this is the question again about, it's because we're looking at two in a row. You're looking at non-reward followed by reward or reward followed by non-reward. So it looks like it knows something. Okay. But I think it all makes sense. It's just the way we're visualizing it.
Because can you also check for any other positions that are not close to the next goal? Is it some sort of like global reward state?
Yeah, we did that actually is in the paper. And it's not that. That's actually a good answer to the question about proximity also. So you can look at, there are analyses that forget exactly what the regressor is, but it's something exactly like that for exactly that reason.
Okay, thank you very much again, Nathaniel.
Thanks.
Last time that you showed the